Okay, good morning. Um, I'm an economist, and of course, I'm inclined, therefore, to look at the economics of this project. And most of what I'll talk about will be the basic economics and how I came over time to realize that they're really quite, in my view, quite flawed. Um, and essentially, I call this investments on economics, right? It's really not much economics in the justification for this Muskrat Falls project. There's business plans based upon monopolization of the market, which Steve already talked about, this sort of iron grip monopoly to force people to pay. But if that weren't in place, this just wouldn't make any commercial sense. Uh, Given that it's in place, it doesn't make any economic sense. Um, I think it's important, though, while I will focus on the costs and the economics of this project, it's important to note that economics is a significant dimension in the whole process here and in our future in terms of what's going to happen. But there's many other dimensions that other people with more knowledge than me can talk about. There's the community concerns. There's the localized environmental impacts. There's a question of corporate governance. How was Nalcor governed and Hydro governed, and how do they have those interlocking or overlapping boards? The lack of separation of Nalcor and its boards from government. How close were they? Why didn't they have more stronger independent mandates? What was the decision-making process and all the things that happened leading up to the Muskrat Falls decision? What about the role of journalism and public information in Newfoundland? There's so many dimensions to this project, and none of them, I think, are sort of happy stories. But let me move on to what I know a little bit more about, which is the economics of the project. First of all, we can just click through them all, I guess, Kerry. I've been looking at hydro-related issues in this province for quite some time. Before I looked at Muskrat Falls, I'd published a number of things on the Churchill Falls contract and what happened there. And one thing I remember, not that was my observation, but it came from Philip Smith's book about Brinko. The leadership of Brinko at the time when they were doing Churchill Falls, at one time he described it as such, particularly the key decision-making person at the time. He said they had the attitude of damned torpedoes full speed ahead. And of course, there we go. We had Churchill Falls and all the negative aspects of Churchill Falls that we've lived with ever since. So I figured, oh, well, we've learned from that. We'd never do that again. Well, here we are. We didn't care about the torpedoes this time around either. It had to be done. And what I've done is I've looked at a number of aspects of Muskrat Falls over the past number of years, really from almost the beginning of the proposal, which I was neither for or against when it first started, but I wanted to see the numbers, wanted to assess what was going on, whether it made sense. But fairly early on, I realized it didn't really seem to pass the basic economics test, the economics level, second or third year economics I would teach. I was thinking, this doesn't really make sense. Maybe there's something else there. And I've been looking at it ever since. You look through these various contributions. I've come to more and more try to understand what's going on. And every time I try to understand it, it makes less and less sense. The economics, in my opinion, just were never there. So let's just go on maybe to the next slide and maybe set up some basic economics here. Looking at modern utility economics. There is a set of knowledge. There is, Dave Vardy, of course, being former chair of the PUB, would know much of this or more than me. But there is a vast body of a discipline within economics that looks at managing public utilities. And very much the traditional approach was to have monopolized public utilities like electricity producers, where the price was based on average cost and the rate of return was kept at some sort of acceptable level that was determined by the regulatory process. But economists have always had some trouble with this, arguing that what we really need from public utilities is to achieve economic efficiency. And price shouldn't be just the outcome of cost. It should be an important ingredient into controlling demand and contributing to the efficient use of resources. And I won't get into the economics, but basically it says price should be according to marginal cost. The price you pay should reflect the actual cost of resources, capital, environmental use of generating the last unit of electricity. And this became, initially it was considered sort of a theoretical possibility, but it became more seen to be implementable beginning in the post-war period in France. Then we had economists. Crucial contribution was the marginal cost pricing and social investment criteria for electricity undertakings. So that was sort of the basic economics. Articles like that were saying, this is how you do it. There's an interaction between your social investment in electricity infrastructure and pricing. And that sort of drove the shift in the United States to FERC, its regulatory agency, to try to make wholesale markets more competitive, with the idea being of bringing electricity prices out that were consistent with marginal cost. And of course, even more recently, there's been the economics of greenhouse gases and a recognition that as long as electricity is generated from sources that use fossil fuels, then there should be a carbon tax associated with the actual burning of those fuels. Now, if we go on to the next slide, where were we pre-Muskrat Falls? We weren't doing marginal cost pricing, which actually would have meant higher prices. So that, of course, led to me being criticized for my suggestion on that. But well, what are we facing now? You know, I was talking about, you know, maybe a couple of cents more per kilowatt hour. Now we're talking double. Now we're talking 23 cents, which is, by the way, just a signal that the project is uneconomic, because if the price you need for it to be commercial is so high that people won't pay that price, then that tells you that was not the project to do. So we were in a situation where our problem was Holyrood. Holyrood was the marginal supplier. It was very costly because of the fuel costs to produce electricity from that plant. In addition to that, there was the greenhouse gas element, which meant that the price actually should have been more than the fuel cost price, because it should reflect the greenhouse gas and other emissions from the plant. That held down, the whole process held down the price of electricity relative to fuel. It's odd. Fuel was going up, but the price from Holyrood was not going up because it was being held down. So what do people with furnaces do? They shift to electric heat. And so instead of the 50-50 split, over time what we had was an ongoing shift of people installing electric heat, because the price signal they gave was the wrong price signal. The price signal they were given was the wrong signal. And people will naturally respond to prices when they're installing heat in their houses, and they're going to try and get the best deal they can for themselves. So now we had the complication of more electric heat, and in the wintertime people turn their heat up, so we have a peaking problem, puts more stress on the Holyrood plant. We did had some relief because the paper mills closed, and that took some of the base load away. But Holyrood, reliance on Holyrood did go down from the peak years, but we still were left with an old plant. Our problem was we didn't have a carbon tax. We had an old plant. Our solution should have been to deal with that. But we took apparently a shotgun approach based upon somehow getting even with Quebec or something. And we ended up with Muskrat Falls assessment being done by, the next one, being done by Nalcor. Nalcor, of course, had the energy plan, or the provincial government, which was largely, I guess, driven by Nalcor, even though they may not have called it Nalcor at the time. The energy plan said, let's do Gull Island. And of course, as always, Muskrat Falls was sort of an add-on, because it had never been ever suggested, I think, before then, that Muskrat Falls by itself was an economically viable project. Now, we had the joint federal provincial environmental assessment panel that looked at that. It went through a lot of hearings in Labrador and elsewhere. They heard the community concerns, and that panel, when it reported, listed many concerns that it had, environmental, community, and otherwise. But it also said it was quite critical that the project itself, saying it wasn't wasn't convinced, at least the evidence wasn't presented, that this project was even in the long-term financial interest of the province. Then we had the government saying, well, we're doing it anyway, and we had it go to the PUB, but in a very narrow sense, not a general assessment as it would be with a normal project. It was just this isolated island option versus Muskrat Falls. And even then, the PUB, in that limited scope and without the time it required or asked for, said it couldn't say which one was the lower cost option. So despite that, two disinterested parties with some expertise looking at it and saying, oh, we're not so sure about this, the government decided to go ahead, and the federal government joined in, gave the loan guarantee, and I think that probably was pivotal. I don't know that they would have actually been able to do it without the federal loan guarantee. And then the government, of course, imposes all sorts of anti-competition legislation to ensure that, again, as Steve pointed out, ratepayers would pay. They couldn't flee. With the link to Nova Scotia, we couldn't import cheaper power. No, we had to buy it. And we couldn't even, if we were Newfoundland industry, we couldn't self-generate. That was banned as well. And so what we had was a situation in which the government was pushing this project. And at sanction, we saw it cost about $7.4 billion. And we were going to get about a little less than 4 million megawatt hours a year annually, because a chunk of that power would have to go to Emera for the maritime link. So we had a lot of issues here. One thing, I guess, to back up a little bit in this slide, when we saw that, no, same slide, when we look at Nalcor's submission to the PUB, they also, it's interesting how they compared things in terms of the alternative. At that time, the project was $6.2 billion. It was a very limited comparison, but also all the comparisons in the sensitivity analysis were pair-wide. So you compare Muskrat Falls to wind. You would compare and say, okay, Muskrat wins based upon their numbers. You compare Muskrat Falls to conservation. Muskrat Falls wins. But at no point was it comparing Muskrat Falls to an integrated plan of conservation, proper pricing, and wind. And of course, if you played with the numbers and look at the numbers they presented, if you did an integrated approach, it wouldn't be too difficult to come up with something that will be better, even within that limited framework. So what do we end up with? Well, the next slide, I guess, is where we ended up with. We ended up with the announcement of the project, the first line there, we have $6.2 billion project. By the time it goes to the PUB, the project in total, the third column over, $7.4 billion. So the PUB assessed it at 6.2 and said, no, we're not sure that that's the lowest cost option. By the time there's sanction, the thing is already 20% more and shovels haven't gone into the ground. Then we get the progression over time. 2014, it goes to 8.3, then it's 8.9, then it becomes, in 2016, it's up to 11.4 billion. Stan Marshall has just taken over around that time. And not only is it 11.4 billion in cost, the whole Astaldi fiasco is really up in the air. That's another $1 billion problem. So once that's sorted out, we see that Stan Marshall basically inherited a $12.7 billion burden, not the original 6.2, but 12.7 billion. Been able to hold it so far at that level, but you're very deep in the hole at $12.7 billion. And of course, the schedule's delayed. So now we're approaching the post-Muskrat Fall era. We're stuck with a project. You can't go back, can't get your money back. It's going to be an ongoing burden. The loan guarantee agreement says that ratepayers must pay. It's really interesting here what happened. The federal government loan guarantee is in place, but as part of that, as an addendum to it, the province agrees that this project will be paid for by ratepayers. So unless that changes, unless there's some amendment, that's where the 23 cents or so comes from that Stan Marshall's announced. That is the framework that's in place. If there's no change, this is sort of automatic. But at 23 cents, who can afford electricity? You'll be driving people to oil furnaces, mini splits, drive some businesses, I guess, out of business, that 23 cents is not really a sustainable price. So the government's talking, and now of course talking about price mitigation. Now remember, this is the price at which the project is supposed to generate its return and its profit. So as soon as you mitigate the price, you're admitting the project's a loser. Okay, it's not a good investment. Still, we don't have any economics involved in terms of pricing. What's the price going to be? And numbers are picked out of the ear. Sometimes people say, well, it shouldn't be any higher than Nova Scotia, but they're different. They're in a different situation. We have to price it according to basic economic principles. No real talk of that yet, although it's early and maybe that will influence things. So then the question becomes, what's the efficient price? Before, when electricity was scarce and the marginal supplier was an expensive plant that should have had a carbon tax on it and should have been the rationale for higher pricing, we're now going to be in a situation where we're going to have all this extra electricity. So we had a shortage before of costly, and it was costly, and we were keeping the price down. Now we're talking about a situation where the supplies increase greatly. A massive amount of electricity will come from that plant, and we're talking about raising the price. It's like a bizarro world when it comes to the economics of it. The efficient price is probably a price around what it is today or lower. But of course, the problem with that is then who and how do you pay for this $12.7 billion project plus the ongoing operating costs that we'll see? So the real problem we face now, given that the project has happened, is how to pay for it and who pays. It's a difficult question of political economy, I guess we would say. So just to conclude, what we had was government and Nalcor ignoring or dismissing warning signs and advice of unconflicted experts. We had the joint panel, the PUB, and various individuals talking about the economics of it. They even, and this is, I think, a big issue that will come up, they even ignored the advice of SNC Lavalin in, I guess it was 2013, and we only found out about it last year, that Lavalin said, hey, this project is riskier than you think, and then we initially thought could be billions of dollars more in cost. That was the report that apparently nobody saw, even though the cover of it says for the client, Newfoundland Hydro or Nalcor, whatever it says on the cover. So all the people who talked about the economics of it, who were unconflicted, said there's a problem. Now, of course, we have other experts. We have environmental experts. We have experts to do with the North Spur. There's a lot of other dimensions to this, as I said at the beginning. But even in terms of the pure economics, there were issues with this. So this, I see, is not a project where it's a conflict between environmental and community concerns on one hand and economics on the other hand. This is, no, they're both on the same side in this case. And if we had an assessment that included efficient pricing and integrated alternatives, I don't think this project would have gone anywhere. That's why they weren't considered, I suspect. If someone wants to, dam the torpedoes and go full speed ahead. So again, the future is getting the price right and bearing the burden. It's not going to be a happy future as far as this project is concerned. Sorry, I can't end on a happier note. Thank you.